Hi, today we're going to talk about Chapter 3. So, like always, if you will get out your notes that you took over Chapter 3 and use this video presentation to help highlight things of importance or maybe add some information to your notes as we go, that will be really helpful for you. So here are our essential questions. We're mainly thinking about biodiversity and why it's so important. So, our case study is all about the country of Costa Rica and the loss of the golden toads, not to be confused with the golden frogs that we watched the videos about from Panama. The golden toads were found on a tiny kind of mountainous cloud forest island, and they were found, and just within about 25 years, they became extinct, and they've never been seen since then. They're this beautiful, bright orange color. Really, they wouldn't be able to miss them if they were still there. And so the loss of this species is also attributed to the rise of the chytrid fungus, which has increased and expanded its range due to climate change. So just to review and talk about biodiversity, we need to think about evolution. Evolution brings about changes, genetic changes in populations. Remember that mutations are small random changes that happen in populations, little changes in the DNA. And species that have beneficial mutations are going to survive at a higher rate and be more likely to pass on their genes. Scientists don't agree on how many species exist in the world, but we know that only a small fraction of them have been described by science. We can use the fossil record to give us an idea about past biodiversity and to see patterns of extinction. Extinction is a natural process, but there's nothing natural about the current rate of species extinctions happening in our modern world. Humans have accelerated the extinction process through their exploitation of the planet. In turn, the human race could suffer from the loss of potential food sources, medicine, and other resources. Species that live in a narrow range of environmental conditions are more likely to go extinct because their populations are more vulnerable. So this is a really important word, endemic species, and these are species that exist only in a very tiny area or a narrow range of environmental conditions. And the pictures you see on this slide are two species that are endemic to central Texas. And when I worked with Nature Conservancy, I worked with these two species, the golden cheek warbler and the black-capped vireo, and we were looking at the threats to their populations in order to prepare conservation action. So these two species, you can see how small their ranges are, and they suffer primarily from habitat loss. We can see that there have been 5 sort of natural mass extinction events that have occurred throughout geologic time on planet Earth. And we've lost a big chunk of species each time that has happened. And those have been triggered by natural events such as meteorites, volcanoes, or climate change. We're living in an age called the Anthropocene, the age of humans, and we are the source of the 6th mass extinction, and there's nothing natural about it. You can see in the chart that the loss of species in modern times is correlated with the growing human population. And if you want to read more about it, this is a great prize-winning book that was written a few years ago that talks about all the ways that we're causing the 6th mass extinction. And one of my colleagues from grad school at KU working in the Natural History Museum has some of her mammal information in this book. So we need to talk more about species and populations and how they use the environment in order to understand biodiversity as a whole. So the niche is a really important term to ecologists. It's often been called a species' ecological address, all the ways they use the environment around them. Some species are niche specialists, meaning they have a very narrow range of what they can use or where they can live, very specific needs, and they're going to be a lot more vulnerable to loss compared to a generalist species with a very broad range. Think about something like a raccoon that can exist even around human populations because they eat our garbage or whatever. We can also look at survivorship patterns to understand the loss of biodiversity and preservation techniques we need to take. There are 3 classic survivorship curves that we sort of lump everything into. Type 1, would include humans. So these are species that have high infant survivorship, relatively speaking, and then a gradual decline in population numbers until death. Type 2 species kind of are vulnerable their whole life to death. So birds have a pretty steady chance of death from the time they're eggs until the time they're adults because of predators and environmental hazards. Type 3 organisms have a very low infant survivorship, so high infant mortality, and typically females will overproduce the young to make up for this infant death. And a frog would be a great example of that, with a big cluster of eggs that the female produces. We also need to understand a little bit about population dynamics to talk about biodiversity. We'll be talking about fluctuations in populations in terms of gains from births and immigration with an I, meaning they're coming into the population, and also their losses, which come from deaths or immigration with an E. And I always think E like exiting the population, leaving the population. We will be using and applying this math a lot more in an upcoming population unit that focuses on human population. But for now, pay attention to this crude birth rate or crude death rate, which normalizes the values of how many births or deaths there are by saying how many happen per 1,000 individuals. That's going to be a really helpful way to help us compare populations, even if they have a variable population size. So make note of these formulas that we're going to come back to a little bit later. Again, they give us ways to talk about population change, and they're going to be really important to us later on. So let's look at some population growth patterns. Exponential growth happens when populations grow out of control with no limiting factors. This is a pattern that we might see when an exotic, non-native species is introduced to an environment where it has no natural predators. Look at the shape of the curve. We often call that a J-shaped curve. Limiting factors are things that keep the population growth in check. So that could include natural events such as predators, weather conditions, etc. And then environmental resistance is like talking about all of those limiting factors together. What are all the things that keep a population from growing? Carrying capacity is the maximum population size that's sustainable for a particular environment. I like this diagram because it shows how some of the limiting factors kind of weigh down on that population, and they flatten the curve because they keep their population growth in check. And we often describe this type of a growth curve as an S-shaped curve or a logistic growth curve. When a population is very dense, it's going to be more susceptible to some of the limiting factors. We call those density dependent factors. So if you live in a big crowd, you're going to be more susceptible to disease or competition for resources. But there are some factors that limit populations that happen no matter the size of your population or your density. And those are just more like natural catastrophic events, including things like fires, floods, tornadoes, etc. For better or worse, humans have increased the carrying capacity of the planet through technology and innovations such as new agricultural techniques that we have invented. But in turn, by increasing the carrying capacity of humans, we've reduced the carrying capacity for other organisms that live in our environment. We can also talk about the characteristics of a population and its susceptibility to extinction based on its reproductive strategies. So biotic potential is all of your potential to reproduce. So species that have low reproductive values, they give birth very seldom, they have long gestation periods, such as elephants and humans, are called K-selected species. Those that reproduce really quickly, have lots of babies, they don't take care of their young, are called R-selected species. And I remember that because I think of R for roaches. Roaches have so many babies, they've survived, millions of years on the planet because they are R-selected species. Many of our endangered species are K-selected. So the increase in one species population can lead to the decline of others, and humans model that. We have displaced biodiversity around us by increasing our population. So one of the solutions to the loss of biodiversity is a conservation approach. Costa Rica, coming back to Costa Rica, our case study country, is a country with extremely high biodiversity, but scientists have become alarmed in recent years as they realize that their extinction rates are spiking. And this caused them to make a plan of action. Costa Rica has modeled a conservation approach for the rest of the world and has slowed down their loss of biodiversity substantially through the implementation of parks and reserves. Instead of using up their natural resources, they can now protect them, and they've opened the world to their parks and reserves through the practice of ecotourism. These are some of my former students planting trees as part of a conservation program when we went to Costa Rica on an ecotourism tour a few years ago. So in conclusion, we have to understand biodiversity and population dynamics in order to make informed decisions about how to slow extinction rates and protect the diversity that remains around us.